In this lecture, I'm just going to discuss real briefly what the main uses are for the primary tools that people use in discovery. So I guess this is kind of a tool that people use in discovery, is the required disclosures under Rule 26A. This includes information that either party is going to use or thinks it might use to support its claims or defenses. You have to produce these without being asked, and usually towards the beginning of the discovery period. I say usually because you might come into more information during the process of discovery that you decide you want to use to support your claims or defenses, and you have to produce those as well. So they're sometimes called initial disclosures, but the requirement to reveal them to your adversary endures throughout the discovery period. And the idea here is that I should know what your argument is going to be before we head into court. Or at least I should know what evidence you are going to bring to bear on your argument. That helps me hone my own argument, and it ensures that I gather discovery that can respond to the evidence that you're going to be presenting. So what do you need to disclose under the required disclosures? Any kind of financial information that you're going to use in calculating the relief that you're asking for. You have to disclose the names and locations or contact information for people you plan to use as witnesses, although you do not have to disclose what you're going to have them say or what you think they will say. But you have to say who they are. So that gives your adversary an opportunity to depose them or find out about them so that they're not blindsided. And just as a general rule, what you'll notice is that discovery is made for the elicitation, the production of evidence. But part of the point here also is to make sure that both sides know all of the evidence in play, and to prevent kind of last minute surprises. So in that sense, it's very different from how the classic kind of movie version of litigation goes. The idea in contemporary litigation is that both sides are pretty well aware of the evidence that each side is getting, and the hope from the court's perspective is to limit the number of issues that have to be litigated, and hopefully to get rid of the litigation altogether by encouraging people to settle. So what are the other discovery tools that people use with each other? The main ones are interrogatories, requests for production, requests for admission, and depositions, and I'll go through each of these in turn. So interrogatories. These are written questions that you serve on your adversary. Your adversary answers them in writing, although they can also produce records to answer them. These are generally limited to 25 questions, unless the parties stipulate otherwise or the court orders otherwise, although sometimes people have sub-questions in the questions. And the use of the way that you use interrogatories is often to get an idea of the scope of information that you're inquiring into, the types of information that you're interested in, the identities of people who you want to depose or whose documents you want to pursue, stuff like that. So you might, for instance, ask, who was on duty that night at the bank, when I allegedly got assaulted by a security officer. So then you get a list of names of everybody on duty who you can potentially depose or look into complaints about them and so on. Or you might ask about information infrastructure. So how do you keep your records about X, Y, or Z? Such that I can better imagine how to request production of those records. So I think of interrogatories as kind of door openers. So let me see which rooms are interesting. Where do I need to investigate further? Interrogatories are good for that. Request for production is when you, having opened the door, go into the room and, rifle through the contents there. So request for production of documents and things. So that might be, all of your receipts from your car mechanic, because I want to claim that your car wasn't actually damaged as much as you claim it was. It might also be your car, so that I can examine it. There was a lot of hype a little while ago about digital information and how it fit into discovery. So you'll see people talking about e-discovery, which was a hot thing in the early part of the 21st century. But at this point, digital information is pretty well incorporated into discovery, and it's assumed that this will also include potentially emails, Facebook records, as we've already seen in a previous case, whatever basically information-bearing materials that we can imagine. And there's no limit on these, so you can, there's no page limit or anything like that. But as always, the court has tremendous power in molding and limiting the scope of discovery. So the court can impose limits if it wants to. Depositions under Rule 30 are basically interviews, but they're interviews under oath with a court reporter there. So they're very useful for getting a full story, getting exculpatory or liability-inducing statements from people, and getting information as well. But often depositions are used not so much for information as to make people tell a story and force them to stick to it because they're under oath. So usually depositions are things you wait on until later on in the discovery process, when you already know what questions you want to ask, when you have a good idea of what the story is that you want to tell, and you can basically use the deposition to help you tell that story. There's a presumptive default limit of 10, although again, the judge can give you more or fewer as you negotiate with the other parties and make motions to the judge. One really big limitation on them is that they're really expensive. Having a court reporter there costs a ton of money. You have to have a room where you can do it, and recording equipment. You have to pay the deponent a not huge amount of money, but there is that payment for a witness. And so usually these are quite limited, and people think really hard about who it is that they want to depose. Finally, we have requests for admission. So these are a little bit different than the other forms of discovery. They're basically a way to get issues off the table and clarify what it is that is not in dispute. So I may have a request for admission that you were driving a certain kind of car when our car crash occurred, or a request for admission that, or you may have a request for admission that, although I'm claiming that my back was injured, I'm not claiming that my leg was injured. So whatever it is that we think might be at issue, but we want to ensure that it is not part of the litigation, get it off the table, we ask for requests for admission. This is one way, for instance, that in the alternative pleadings that people can make in complaints and answers are resolved. So I might have pleaded in the alternative that I wasn't in town that day, and if I was in town that day, I was asleep at the time, and if I wasn't asleep at the time, I was drunk or whatever. Well, you can request an admission that I was in fact in town that day. And once I've admitted that, for the purposes of this lawsuit, although no further, I am considered to have been in town that day. And just note what I just said, requests for admission, when you admit something, you only admit it for the purposes of the lawsuit. So you are not exposing yourself to future liability, for instance. You're not making a statement about the overarching metaphysical truth of the matter. You're basically making a stipulation. For the purposes of this lawsuit, I agree that I was in town that day, and so we do not need to litigate. We don't need a jury to determine whether I was in town that day. One thing to note is I've presented these in a certain kind of order, but actually these things, these tools are used all through the discovery process. So you don't have to do these in any particular order. And in fact, if the first thing you want to do is issue a request for production or even depose somebody, that's fine, you can do that. Usually, however, people start off with interrogatories to get the lay of the land, but you usually don't use all of your interrogatories in one swoop. You ask a few questions, that opens some doors, you decide where you want to investigate, you do a request for production, that gives you more information and it raises more questions, so you pose a few more interrogatories, get a little more information about the scope of stuff you're interested in, do another request for production that might reveal a really important witness. Oh, okay, now you might be ready to do your first deposition. And then you issue another couple of interrogatories and so on. You go back and forth among these. You use them contemporaneously.